Well, I think the reality is that it's still very much tied to national states. And these states have some difficulty in reimagining themselves as immigrant societies. So I think that is the first challenge for Europe, you know, to have inclusive societies where citizens feel that they are part of the French idea of citizenship or Dutch traditions or German. And secondly, the second challenge is, I think, to ask the question whether a European citizenship beyond the formalities of today can really become something living. And that is very much tied to the question, can Europe become a living democracy? I think four things, actually. One is one needs to ask the question, what sort of skills do you need as a citizen? Language is obviously very important. And you see not only many with a migrant background have difficulty in mastering the language, but actually a lot of, a substantial part of the native population are far less able in reading and writing and speaking than one should think. I think that's very important element of citizenship, simply the ability to express yourself. Secondly, you should ask yourself, what sort of knowledge do we need? What sort of knowledge of the history of a society you're part of at a European level, some understanding of, you know, how Europe works, the legal aspects. So that is a big question, you know, what sort of knowledge do we need and what sort of education do we need, not only in terms to prepare people for a life as a professional, in a professional sense, but also to prepare people to be an active citizen. Thirdly, I think it has to do with norms, ideas about, for example, religious freedom, and understanding that the rights of a citizen are very closely bound to responsibilities. In a sense, the responsibility to defend the same freedoms for others. And we see throughout Europe, for example, when we look at religious freedom, the temptation not to be, you know, faithful to that ideal. And lastly, I think it's about an idea of participation. And participation as a citizen means that we should worry very much about, for example, the level of unemployment now in Europe and the number of people who are able to work and willing to work, you know, who are on the margins of the labor market or pushed outside of it. That's just one example. There are, of course, various other ideas about participation as a volunteer in civil society. But for me, those are the four big questions. Skills, the knowledge you need, the sort of normative aspect, you know, the ideas of freedoms as a right and a responsibility, and participation. That is a substantial answer, isn't it? It is. Yeah. Yeah, why am I here? I've been invited to a lot of these conferences of Soul for Europe, and I think it's an important element, although I'm practical, so in many ways, you know, I think all the talking about talking and, you know, all the philosophies about culture, where I think, you know, in the end, if I look at artists or writers or filmmakers or whatever, you know, I never hear them about Europe's culture. They are, you know, immersed in creating something. And when it's really important, it is local, but in its locality, it's also universal. And then the boundaries of Europe are not that relevant in a sense. So, you know, in many ways, it's a little bit too political, all the talking about culture. But I personally, for example, making now a documentary film together with a filmmaker based on a book or inspired by a book I've made about immigration in Europe, and we show the story of 50 years of immigration in Europe on the basis of archive material, you know. You see people arriving 50 years ago and the whole story unfolds. And why is it important? I think for two reasons. First of all, to tell a story about immigration, because a lot of the uneasiness springs from the fact, that people have no idea in what sort of story they are caught. They see the world around them changing, but they have no clue about a longer narrative, and a narrative which also implies a lot of conflict, because I didn't find much migration history without conflict. So that is one aspect, telling a story. And secondly, to tell a story that transcends national boundaries. In a sense, there are so many films about Turkish community in Berlin, or Algerians in Marseille, or Pakistanis in Birmingham, etc. But there is no film actually imagining how Europe has changed through migration. So to tell the story, as we do in this film, of 6 cities, and then 50 years, and it will be a series for television, but also a documentary film, I think that is how I think about it in practical terms, why it is important to imagine a story about Europe, a story that shows the similarities of what happens in many parts of Europe. And I think we haven't been able enough in Europe to imagine this commonality in various ways. So that is one way of looking at it, at the relevance of culture or the visual arts or literature in thinking about Europe. Well, because in the end it's the story of democracy we're talking about, and asking the very difficult and perhaps not easy to answer question, is it possible to have a living democracy on a scale of 500 or 700 million people? And it's no wonder that so many big continental states have a serious democratic deficit, not only China, of course, but in India, and also the United States or Brazil, such vast entities in terms of territory, but also the sheer size of the European population of these 27 nations. You could ask yourself, to what extent will we be really in a situation that we have a functioning democracy on that vast scale? But it's a very existential question, because Europe is in the process of having all these relations. The Greek deficit is now our deficit. The immigrants arriving in Spain are the future citizens, perhaps, of the Netherlands. Berlusconi is our politician as well in the Netherlands or in Britain. And I think the problem for me, in the end, is that the construction of Europe, people have been told that it entails a lot of benefits, and it does, but nobody has ever told to citizens that it entails also a lot of costs and problems, that you can export a lot of stability, but you import also instability. And that is part of the reality of Europe and the shared destiny of European nations. But if the Greek deficit is really also our deficit, that entails a lot of conflict and conflicting opinions, but that is for me the moment when perhaps we begin to understand what the reality of European citizenship could mean. Because the elections in Greece are also our elections. The French president is to some extent our president as well. So one feels how difficult it is to embrace this huge continent with so many different political systems, traditions. But that is, in the end, what it's all about, and that is why I think it matters enormously, and to the extent that people think of themselves as being part of a living democracy, and that it's worthwhile to be engaged one way or the other and have a possibility to influence the course of events. But also, I was thinking also very practically, for me, Europe is because we have all these languages, and money travels easily, music travels to a great extent easily, but in many ways, literature or things that have been written, all the energy devoted to translation, and for me, Europe is also a culture of translation. And of course, as we all know, a lot get lost in translation. But in the end, you know, the energy devoted to making Europe visible to itself. How much do we really know what is going on in Sweden? How much do we really understand what is going on in Italy? And the voices of those countries, you know, to translate them into other languages, this constant effort of translation. We could do far more in that area because Europe, in a sense, is not visible to itself. And perhaps that is a very concrete way, you know, to devote more energy and more funds to encouraging a culture of translation.